Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. My name is Pat Murphy, Head of Environment Knowledge Transfer with Teagasc, and coming to you this morning from a sunny, clear, crisp Athenry, not our usual haunt. I'm joined this morning by Kathryn Keena, also in Athenry this morning. Good morning, Kathryn.
Morning, how are you?
And I'm delighted to be joined by Kathryn Finney. Kathryn is project manager with the Curlew EIP to discuss the progress and that project, which is focused on the, I suppose, the welfare of one of our marquee bird species that's under a huge amount of threat. Kathryn, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Pat.
Kathryn, you might just describe to us your background. You've been with Birdwatch Ireland for significant time, and how you ended up trying to save and protect the curlew.
Well, I suppose, Pat, I have a background in agri-environment, and I've been with Birdwatch now for, I think it's nearly 19 years.
Time flies when you're having fun.
It does. It seems to have flown by. It's longer than I'd care to admit, definitely. And I suppose I have a background in agri-environmental scheme design, specialist advisory and predator management. So that's largely, I've been working with breeding waders for most of my time with Birdwatch Ireland. So yeah, they're species, I'm from the Shannon Callow, so they're a species that I would have grown up with, so they're quite close to my heart.
Very good. Well, listen, without further ado, I'll get you, if it's okay, to share your presentation with us.
The Irish Breeding Curlew EIP, it was established to try and develop agri-environmental solutions to the decline of curlew. As Pat mentioned, it's one of our most threatened bird species. It's a multi-partnership project between Birdwatch Ireland, the Irish Grey Partridge Trust, the Irish Natura Hill Farmers Association and Teagasc. It was originally a 3.5-year project. It was to run until December 2021. However, we've been extended twice. The project operated in two very distinct areas. The Lower Loch Corrib, which is a wet grassland, a lowland wet grassland site, and the South Leitrim Bogs area, which is a mixture of blanket bog and damp rushy pasture. Of course, curlew are one of our breeding wader species, and they're our most threatened breeding wader species. And as I said, I've been working with breeding waders now for my career with Birdwatch Ireland. And in the time that I've been working with breeding waders, I've watched all of these bird species become red listed, and I've watched curlew and now very recently lapwing make it onto the globally threatened with extinction list. So I suppose, needless to say, these species haven't been doing well in Ireland over the last 30 to 40 years. And if we want to protect them and we want them to still exist for our children, we really need to kind of get on top of this. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the declines, curlew was once a very, very widespread species across the landscape. And back in the 70s and early 80s, there were estimated to be about 8,000 pairs. But over the last 30 to 40 years, they've declined dramatically. And by 2011, we realised there was something really seriously going wrong. And that was really what kick-started a lot of the action for curlew. Unfortunately, things have declined. The species have declined even more since then. And based on the last national survey, which was in 2000, I think it was 2021, there is only now estimated to be about 100 breeding pairs left nationally. So that was quite a catastrophic decline. We are looking at species extinction for curlew in Ireland within the next 10 to 15 years if we cannot get on top of this. So the declines, why are the declines so severe? We know that there has been significant loss and fragmentation of breeding habitat, both from there's been new pressures such as wind farms, afforestation, and of course there's been destruction of peatlands. Of course, wind farms and afforestation is something that is positive and that we do need in this country, but they need to be appropriately targeted. And we do know that wind farms can't displace curlew when they're located in their breeding areas. We also know that afforestation not only leads to a direct loss of habitat, because of course, curlew, like all breeding weight species, will nest near forests or scrub. But it also leads to an increase in predation pressure for about 1 kilometre from the edge of that forest. So it has kind of quite significant on curlew. Of course, wind farms and afforestation have traditionally been targeted at the areas where curlew and other breeding waders tend to breed. So that's kind of led to a fragmentation of breeding habitat. On top of that, we know that a lot of our bogs have been lost to commercial extraction over the last 20, 30 years, 40 years. And in addition to that, we know there's been a loss of grasslands and semi-approved pastures through agriculture intensification. Agricultural operations breeding season can have an impact, and of course the increase in mechanization in agriculture and the intensification of agriculture has led to a change of practices which can impact breeding curlew, breeding waders. There's also been an increase in predation of nests and chicks. So we know that declines always start with habitat loss and fragmentation, and when the habitat is suboptimal, that in itself can lead to population decline. In addition, it can also make the population more vulnerable to predation, and again, that further fuels population declines. On top of that, we know that there's been an increase in predator numbers nationally. So we know from the bird atlases that corvid populations have increased. And we know obviously in the last 30, 40 years, we've had populations have increased. Anecdotally, we know that there has been an increase in fox numbers, and that stands to reason because back in the 80s, there was a bounty, quite a significant bounty on foxes. And, you know, coming from a rural area, everyone I knew was shooting foxes back then, whereas now I only know a handful of people control fox. So waders are ground nesting farmland birds. It's important to remember that they are farmland birds and they are reliant on the farming systems. They nest in approved and semi-approved pasture, upland and lowland bogs, wet grassland. Curlew sometimes nest in improved grasslands and silage fields, and lapwing will of course nest in arable land. And it's quite telling to say that there's no one habitat in Ireland that these species are doing well in. So that just gives you a sense of the scale of the problem. They breed between March and mid-July, so it's quite a narrow and short breeding season. Feed mainly on soil invertebrates. Of course, in winter breeding, they disperse to coastal areas and wetlands, and they form large flocks. We also get a large number of birds from northern Scandinavia, northern Europe, come over here to winter. So that in a way has masked within the public domain. It's kind of masked the declines we've been facing of these species, because when you're seeing hundreds and hundreds of flocks of hundreds of these birds, it's very hard to get your head around the fact that they're actually critically endangered. All of these birds are semi-colonial. Curlew least so, but it is still loosely colonial, and that can be a positive and a negative. It can help act as a protection from predation, but it can also mean that a predation incident in a colony, or say an agricultural operation in a colony that's causing damage, can cause complete breeding failure of that colony. Yeah. Okay, so all 4 species can be provided for by providing a mixed sward, and this is the sward height and the sward structure during the breeding season is incredibly important. Lapwing like to nest on really, really short ground. They don't like to be surrounded by vegetation. Curlew like to nest in longer patches of vegetation where they can hide their nest, and redshank and snipe like to nest in tussocks. And it's really important that this sword structure is correct during the breeding season. If it's too long, the birds can't see predators coming and they will abandon. And if it is too short, there's nowhere for them to hide their nest. As soon as the chicks are hatched, they leave the nest cup and they're responsible for feeding themselves. And they're just tiny little balls of fluff. This, of course, is a lapwing chick. They need damp flushes, damp pasture, and kind of short grass in order to kind of find the ground-dwelling vertebrates that they feed on. And this is really important for them. They also need patches of longer vegetation to hide in and to hide from predators in. And this is also really important for them. Research from the UK has actually shown that the single most significant factor in successfully fledgling curlew chicks is sword structure during the breeding season. And it's important that it is correct during the breeding season, during peak breeding. As I said, it's a very short window of the breeding season is a very short window. There's no point in having sword structure and the habitat conditions correct, say in July when the birds have finished breeding. So it's a very dynamic element, but it's incredibly important. None of these species will nest generally within 100 meters of a tree or bush or scrub or forest, and they don't like anywhere kind of surrounded by forests, because of course this is where the predators are that will target their nests and chicks. So the Curlew EIP, we have been developing a number of options. We had a number of habitat options, including results-based habitat option, delayed mowing option for curlew in meadowland, capital works, knowledge transfer groups. Key to the project was the development of an agri-environmental scheme for farmers to carry out predator control, and that was the conservation keeping scheme. We also trialled temporary nest fences and satellite tagging and some contractor training. Farmer participation was really, really high. We were massively oversubscribed for all of our options. We had about 47 farmers and about 250 hectares in the scheme. And we had 35 farmers in the habitat option, another 33 in the conservation keeping option. And many of these were in both options. The curlew habitat option was a results-based option, and it was supported by specialist advisory and training for farmers. We know what curlew and breeding waders need in terms of habitat, so all of the elements that were scored were all very important for producing breeding habitat and for protection from predation. We had our top scoring for a 10 out of 10 field. The payment rate was 430, and the measurer was capable of overlaying many of the gloss options, so we were able to offer top-up rates for those. So the results, what we found is for fields in the scheme for at least 2 years, there was a highly significant increase in field scores between years. And of course, an increase in field scores results in an increase in payment rates for the farmer, and it also leads to an increase or improvement in breeding habitat, and that's what we're after. Of significance was the fact that between 2020 and 2021, there was no significant increase in field scores. And generally what you would find in the first year of a project, that your field scores would improve from the baseline score. But what was different in this particular instance was that in 2020, of course, everybody was grounded due to COVID, and there was no farmer training in place. And that was the only year that we found no significant increase in field scores. So as long as I've been working in agri-environment, we've known that the delivery and farmer training is absolutely crucial to the on-the-ground delivery and success of higher biodiversity measures. So it's actually nice to see this borne out by the results, even if it, in this case. When all fields were included, there was a significant increase in average field score year on year, and even between areas. So in Carib, there was a highly significant increase in field scores year on year, every year. And in Leitrim, there was a highly significant increase in field scores every year for 2020 and 2021. To note here is Corrib as a lowland wet grassland site. It automatically had higher field scores because the habitat was just that little bit different and a little bit better for breeding waders. In Leitrim, it was a very difficult landscape. What we had was a lot of blanket bog surrounded by scrub and trees, and then surrounding that was like nice damp rushy pasture, but quite often they were suffering from a lot of scrub and trees and on the margins of them. So it was quite a difficult landscape, Leitrim, but it was really good to see that we were still able to influence an improvement in habitat quality. Many of our elements of our scorecard and our capital works have made it into the acres breeding wader scorecard. And of course, this is only in the acres CP areas at the moment, but we would hope that with the advent of the National Breeding Wader Project, that many of these elements will be carried through nationally to all areas where curlew and breeding waders are. A really key element of our project was the development of an agri-environmental scheme for farmers to carry out predator control. And as long as I've been with breeding waders, predation has been, a key issue that we've needed to address. And I suppose we've long known that this was something that was needed. However, it can be quite a difficult measure to develop. And really, until now, and until the advent of locally led schemes and schemes that are supported by specialist advisory, the delivery mechanism for a measure such as this just hasn't been there. So with the advent of this type of delivery mechanism, it's really opened the door to being able to develop a measure like this. Really, it's something that we have known for a long time is needed because predation has been an issue for breeding waders for as long as I've been working with them. But the delivery mechanisms weren't there before. And really, the advent of locally led and schemes, agri-environmental schemes supported by specialist advisory has really opened the door for the development of a measure like such as this. So we realised very clearly very early on that we needed to create a completely different product. This isn't predator management for sport or predator management for game bird management. It is conservation keepering, and it has a clear rationale and very, very clear objectives, and that is to conserve a species and to help productivity of a species. There is an emphasis on ethics and standards, and the equipment and methods meet the highest ethical and legal standards. And we spent a lot of time on this in researching best practice internationally and looking at our equipment and looking at our standards and our methods. And in many cases, we went far, far above the legal requirements nationally. Key to the implementation of this scheme was the development of policies and standards, and this really was the governed the work of our conservation keepers and also the farmers in the conservation keeping scheme. It set out clearly the rationale for predator control in these instances and when it is appropriate to carry it out and when it is not. It also very, very clearly set out the methods and the equipment that could be and should be employed. And as I said, it was a really important document that covered the work for the last couple of years in this project. So what we had a really big interest and a high uptake from farmers, and this really was a real surprise. I suppose, we thought that this was a skill that was lost from the landscape and that farmers maybe wouldn't take it up. But we were massively, massively oversubscribed, and we could have taken in many, many more farmers. On talking to the farmers who entered, I think one of the biggest things they said was that there was a clear understanding among the farming community that they knew the legislation had moved on and they knew the methods and best practice had moved on, and they didn't feel confident in carrying out predator control because they felt that they could have been out of date, that their knowledge was out of date. They also liked the fact that it had a very clear objective. It was for a purpose. It was to help save Ireland's biodiversity and the biodiversity on their farm. So it was a huge interest from them. Each farmer received about 20 hours training before they even started their option. So they received advice and training in insurance, the governing legislation, and of course a lot of the governing legislation on predator control is the criminal legislation, and they also received detailed training in the scheme requirements and the scheme methods. We helped them apply for the wildlife licenses, and of course all predator control is governed by wildlife licenses, so we made sure that all of these were in place for them. We gave them training in the equipment and the methods of control that were permitted by the project. So before the farmers even opened a trap, they were fully insured, they were legally protected, and they were absolutely crystal clear on the requirements and the methods that they were carrying out. Each farm was tailored to a farmer's chosen methods and capabilities. So a farmer could choose any methods of control that were permitted. And we assessed their capabilities in terms of firearms. We set very stringent requirements on the caliber of rifle and the type of shot that could be used. And if a farmer couldn't meet those requirements, then they weren't permitted into any of the shooting options. Only equipment specified the project could be used, and in this instance, we supplied the equipment to the farmers. Key element of the scheme was that farmers could work on another farmer's land, and this is really, really important, especially when you're dealing with conservation keeping, where you might have a farmer in a key area for a breeding site, but they're not comfortable carrying out predator control. But the farmer down the road might be happy to incorporate their land as part of their plan. And this was a possibility. And farmers were very comfortable with this because obviously they felt they were fully insured, so they were fully protected. The farmers were paid by time. It was not an area-based payment, and it was not a numbers-based payment. It's not about controlling numbers, it's about controlling the right predators at the right time. And we could make up a plan for these farmers based on whatever methods they chose. What we generally found was about 12 to 14 hours per week for a new entrant was, an optimum number of hours per week. And as I said, we could make that 12 to 14 hours per week up at any point out of any method that they had chosen to deliver. So just to give you an indication of how successful the farmers were at catching predators, they were incredibly successful. And you can see really high background predator numbers here. They didn't control, they controlled lower numbers of foxes than maybe you might expect, but that was because many farmers just do not have the firearms anymore and do not have and aren't interested in carrying out fox control. But for the other predators, they're very, very significant at controlling high background populations. It should be borne in mind that these farmers were immediately adjacent to or in curlew breeding territory. So this was quite a small number of farmers very tightly around where we had breeding curlew. So it gives an indication of the scale of the predator problem that these birds are under. Of course, we had full-time conservation keepers on hand, and they were central to the training of the farmers, and they were also carrying out predator control during the breeding season. And again, when you combine their catch, and again, this is very tightly in and around where the curlew are breeding, you can see that the background predator population, the landscape is just massive. Look, we're up on what 1,400 predators in Leitrim in 2022. Of course, our conservation keepers were far more significant at controlling fox, and that's generally because it's quite a specialised skill. So going forward, the conservation keeping scheme, it hasn't made it into the National Agri-Environmental Programme this time. I would be fairly confident that going forward, it will eventually make it in, especially if I have anything to do with it. It is incredibly important at removing background predator populations at a landscape level. And I suppose it's important to say that it is not meant to, and it was not designed to replace professional conservation keepers. When these birds are as critical as this, we need professional conservation keepers working tightly in and around them, and especially for the control of foxes. So the conservation keepering scheme for farmers, it was about supporting this and carrying out predator control at a landscape level. It has the potential to be rolled out nationally to all areas with ground nesting birds affected by depredation, and of course this includes corncrake, hen harrier and grouse, as well as breeding waders. So going forward, what we'll probably look to is having a look at some improving the auditing capabilities of the scheme. And of course, we also need to start a national discourse on predator management. I mean, it needs to be recognised that it is a legitimate and essential conservation tool for the protection of our ground nesting birds. We also need to look at building capacity. I mean, we do not have a culture of professional keepers in this country, and that's something that we need to look to. And it's something that myself and Shane here in the photo, our conservation keeper, have been working on over the last number of years. We've taken in assistant keepers to try and build capacity and train some up, but we've also worked with college students to put it on their radar as a career path going forward. And quite simply, if you can't see it, you can't be it. We also trialled some new technologies. So we carried out satellite tagging, and we used that satellite tagging to locate nests and to trial our nest fencing. It also helped us direct our conservation keepers and direct our predator control to try and influence fledgling. We combined our data with NPWS, who are also carrying out satellite tagging, and that data was analysed to show how the birds are using the surrounding habitat and what kind of habitats they need during the different stages of their breeding cycle. And also it's going to help inform targeting of agri-environmental measures. So how many kilometres of habitat around a known breeding site do you need to bring in to an agri-environmental measure to help ensure successful breeding? Satellite tagging has also informed what we know about curlew breeding populations. Together with satellite tagging within the UK, we found that there's been behavioural issues that are behavioural elements that we weren't aware of. So for instance, traditionally by standard practice, if you had a bird displaying or behaving territorial, that was considered probable breeding. From satellite tagging, what we've actually found is non-breeding birds, say birds that are too young to breed or just are not breeding in that particular year, are actually also behaving sometimes territorial and can indeed kind of loosely chick call. So it's rewritten some of what we know about the behaviour of non-breeding birds, and that's going to help inform our conservation measures going forward. We trialled a number of nest fences, and where we managed to locate the nests, we found that they were very successful at influencing successful hatching for the birds. However, in the landscapes that we were working in, and because curlew were very secretive, very difficult to find their nests, only one of these nests was found through survey work. Unfortunately, sat tagging is not a long-term solution because the birds eventually become trap shy and they can't be caught. So eventually we're going to have to look to how we can kind of put in place measures to find nests more successfully. So in terms of the populations within the project area, I suppose because we know that not all probable pairs were actually breeding, we've analysed the productivity data based on the number of pairs we had that we knew were breeding. And of course, we know what we need in order to influence population stability and population growth. So for the pairs that confirmed breeding, we influenced population growth in both areas in 2019. And then in Corrib in 2020 and 2022 also. Whereas we only managed to influence population growth or stability for in Leitrim in 2019 and 2023. And this has been borne out by the population, the total population figures that we have for these areas. So as you can see in Corrib, the population has increased, started to increase in 2023. And of course, that's on the back of a couple of years of population growth, productivity. In Leitrim, where we had many years where we weren't managing to influence population, our productivity, the population has declined. And again, what we have in Leitrim is a very difficult landscape. There are a lot of issues going on up there that this project didn't have the capabilities to solve. And of course, we know that our curlew population, the adult population, is aging and they are starting to die off. So if we don't have recruitment into the system, we are going to lose these birds. And of course, in Corrib, we have a number of other wader species. And during the lifetime of the project, their population started to increase as well. And we know that the measures that we can implement for curlew are also beneficial to these other wader species. So measures of success, I suppose, I've been working in agri-environmental scheme design for most of my career with BirdWatch Ireland. So we always there's really three measures of a success, and they're all central to how these schemes deliver on the ground. I suppose the first one is, have you developed a scheme that works? Is it capable of improving habitat, and is it capable of influencing productivity? Followed by that, has it been adopted by the national programme? If it's not rolled out and if it's not implemented at the wider scale, then it doesn't matter how good it is. So has it been adopted by the national programme? And the last and very crucial element of this is effective rollout. And in this, advisors are absolutely crucial to successful rollout. And it is really, really important that they are supported and by training and advice on this and how to roll out these higher biodiversity measures. Farming training, we know, is absolutely essential. And farmers are crucial in imparting their knowledge to these farmers. And really, it's this mechanism and this element that is going to be the difference between whether these schemes work on the ground and work going forward. I think it's been, I've been really privileged as part of the EIP. I've been very lucky in the Corrib area to be able to do a complete handover to the Acres West team in Corrib. And that included, I was able to provide their project team and their advisors with training and advice on how to, what these curlew and what these breeding waders need in the area, and also how to score the scheme, how to score the measures, what habitat to look for, and where to locate their NPIs and landscape actions. So I suppose it's really over to the advisors at this point in terms of the successful implementation of this measure on the ground.
Really fascinating. And I think one of the things that strikes me, it's a real vindication of the EIP process. We've had a huge amount of learning from the EIPs that we had in the last round, and we're starting a process, or the department are starting a process of recruiting again the EIPs for the next phase. And to me, it's a real evidence of the learning that we can get from these small scale and projects. And I think it's now crying out for I suppose an extension and a broadening of the learning. I suppose one of the questions you talked about the handing over to the CP team in Connacht, but the CPs are predominantly around the upland areas, and I presume there's a lot of the habitats you're wanting to protect are not in those habitat areas. And I suppose the question arising from that is, are there a number of areas that effectively need to be added for specifically for breeding waders to the approach that the CPs, and I'm not being critical of the CPs because I think there's an amazing job being done, but is is your main finding that we need to extend it to other areas?
Yeah, and actually, I'd probably in the kind of in the pauses, I probably missed part of that. Yes, absolutely, and certainly, Birdwatch Ireland has carried out hotspot mapping for breeding waders, and what we've shown is that a lot of these breeding wader hotspots and curlew hotspots are actually located outside of the CP areas. Now, we do know we do have a national breeding wader EIP coming on stream next year. And so that should hopefully take up delivery for these birds in these areas. But at this point, we don't really know the structure of that because it hasn't been advertised yet.
And I suppose one of the things that kind of probably strikes people as being a little bit counterintuitive is the requirement to do predator control to protect some of these species. It probably, there's a lot of people it probably doesn't sit well with, but it's an absolute necessity, I think, from what you've described.
Absolutely, and I mean, I suppose there's no two ways about it. You know, we have influenced the predation issues. So as we've kind of fragmented or created suboptimal habitat for these species, we've made them more vulnerable to predation in the first instance. But then changes in our agricultural enterprises has also led to an increase in predator numbers as well. So, you know, at this point, they should be self-balancing, but we have actually put it out of balance. And now we need to step in and rectify that. And we have to, I suppose, we have to understand that there's very clear rationale to this. It's not about kind of controlling for sport. It's about controlling during the breeding season to allow successful breeding.
You looked at, I suppose, mainly when you described the species of prey, it was crows that you were particularly looking at. And we've had a lot of, or some success in the raptor species over the last number of years, but do they form a threat as well? Is there a balancing act there, or are they not a threat to our breeding waders?
No, absolutely. Look, everything with a mouth or a beak is a threat to breeding curlew and breeding waders. But we do know the species that are driving population declines. So definitely there are species, they will take them, but they're maybe not the main drivers. We know that the main drivers of population declines are grey crow, magpie, fox, and mink. And that's not to say that other species won't take them, but they're not causing that kind of national decline.
Okay. Kathryn, huge number of questions coming in.
Yes, lots of questions. And again, thanks to Kathryn for coming on, and Pat, following on from about the good work from EIPs. It's something I'm very conscious of. And even when reports get written up, I think it's, coming on the Signpost webinar really brings it to a wider audience. So I think it justifies our involvement in them, doesn't it? It's really key part at this end of the process. Kathryn, you talked about the importance of sward structure at specific times of the year. How does that, for nesting or whenever, how does that tie in with the scoring, or when is the best time to score these lands?
Oh yeah, I mean, if you are in a CP zone and you're implementing a breeding wader scorecard, it's absolutely crucial that this is scored in and around kind of mid to the end of May, beginning of June, because I suppose it's a highly dynamic aspect. You know, sward structure, whether it's short, long, mixed, you know, whatever, it's very, very dynamic. And you can have a situation where it is absolutely perfect in July, but sure, what's the point in it being perfect in July if the birds are finished breeding?
Okay, thanks. I'll keep going with the questions. The conservation keeping scheme, I suppose, when people think of firearms and different things, they worry about health and safety. Were there any issues that arose, or have you identified, or how do you manage those kind of issues?
No, I mean, we ran this measure now for 3 years with 33 farmers. We have absolutely no problems, no non-compliance issues, no breaches of the legislation, no accidents. at all.
Okay.
And I suppose key to that was the farmers were really, really well trained in. They knew exactly what the legislation was and what their requirements were. And they were really well covered, really well insured, and really well trained going into it. They went into this measure with their eyes wide open.
Okay, thanks. Kathryn, a lot of people are picking up on the tree issue, and I think it's new to people. And just a couple of ones. Is there any difference between native woodland as opposed to coniferous forests? No better.
No
A tree
pressure.
a tree is a tree is a tree. Yeah.
A tree
Okay.
is a tree. It's a perching post for
It's a
corvids,
perching post. Yeah.
or
Okay.
home for predators.
Yes. Somebody in Carlow knew them in the 70s on the farm. Is there any way of getting them back? And tillage, but not very intensive. When they're gone, are they gone?
It's difficult. I mean, they're considered to be, all breeding major species, including curlew, are considered to be site faithful. Now, that can mean site faithful to within 20 kilometres in and around, but quite often they come back to the same field. So there is a range, but very often it's the same field. I suppose if they're if they're in the general locality, they're possibly, but I mean, you would need to look at growing the population and ensuring that the habitat is suitable for them.
And Kathryn, one for advisors now. I hear advisors talking about who are drawing up, putting in the NPIs in the CP plans, and the wader scrapes where the field is identified as breeding wader, but there's a lack of water. Can you just, it seems to be getting a lot of questions on that. Can you just elaborate on how an advisor would encourage a farmer to put in a wader scrape? And what is it?
Yeah, like a wader scrape is it's a really, really, really shallow. I mean, it's very, very shallow. It's probably a foot max. And it's really it's not a pond, because what we're looking for is the kind of damp, wet mud. And that's where, if you think of a hot sunny day, that's where all the invertebrates and the insects are going to be for the chicks. So they are very crucial in areas and fields where maybe they don't have natural kind of wet areas, or they don't have kind of river margins that are suitable.
Approximately what size, width and length ish?
I mean, I think the sizes in the MPIs in the CP zones are
don't worry about the detail, but they're small is what I'm getting at.
They're small. They are small.
Yeah.
And actually what we were trialing, I think the measures that the scrapes that we were putting in on this EIP were considerably larger. We were putting in 10 by 12 meter scrapes with 2 foot deep at the bottom. What's central to these scrapes is that the soil is like that the slope of them is no more than a 35-degree angle, and that's absolutely crucial. And I suppose what other element which would be central to them is that they're not replacing areas that are suitable for the birds. You're not putting it in a place that's already suitable. It's meant to augment and increase the amount of habitat. And of course, they're very, very important, because if you only have 1 or 2 of these and you've all the chicks feeding around the margins of that particular area, then one predation incident can wipe out all of them.
And Kathryn, just the practicality. So you get a digger, you do your scrape, and you put the soil. Where do you put the soil?
It's important that you spread the soil over the kind of surrounding landscape. You don't create this sort of ledge effect.
Hump. Okay. Super. That's really practical advice and very timely, because lads are putting these in as we speak. Do you want to take one or two,
Kathryn?
Pat?
I suppose we were at a water quality conference, and there was a whole session on the extra challenges we're going to face as a result of climate change. And it strikes me that a move to drier summers and potentially higher rainfall events could also be challenging to some of these species.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, they can. I mean, if you get significantly heavy rain just as the chicks are hatching, the chicks can die just shortly after hatching. So it is going to prove massively challenging. It'll probably mean wader scrapes and these measures are actually more important going down the line, because they can hold water for a little bit of time during the dry periods. But yeah, definitely it's going to prove challenging for everything.
Kathryn, coming back on your results of the actual, now it's very short term, as you said, but did the field scores increase the curlew population, or how long does it take to do that if everything was done right? Comment on that.
I suppose what we've seen in the Carib area, the combined effort of conservation keeping, farmers carrying out predator control, and the habitat did improve productivity, and it did improve the population. Again, in Leitrim, while the habitat, we did influence an increase in field scores, there are other factors that are more challenging up in that landscape. But certainly, I've come off the Shannon Callows, and I've done a lot of wader work in the Shannon Callows, and we do know from past experience that sometimes all it takes is getting the habitat right to improve populations.
And I suppose a question in relation to the continuing of the agriculture as well. Are you talking about reducing agriculture, or have you been looking at ways to maintain maybe a modified form of agriculture, but with still a significant output, or are you looking at reduced output agriculture?
You're probably looking at low intensity agriculture. Definitely, these species, they need kind of reduced stocking levels of about 1 livestock unit per hectare until the 1st of July. And that's key to say that it is only until, it is a very brief period. And no tractor operations until kind of in and around July as well. Just when the chicks, they are ground nesting birds, so it's just to protect them from the agriculture operations. A reduction in fertilizer, because if you have a big thick sward, it's not suitable for breeding in, and it's not, the chicks can't get through it to feed on and find the invertebrates. So I suppose we need to bear in mind as well that although the measure is targeting curlew and breeding waders, it's also providing for water quality and carbon, because you're looking at reduced fertilizer inputs, and you're looking at kind of not draining that particular area and keeping water tables high or relatively high in those areas. So it does have other spin-off for climatic objectives.
The policy on where we may be increasing the water table to conserve the carbon in peat soils. I wonder, any of those areas, might that be a help to the curlew and the breeding waders?
That definitely, that would be complementary to what would be needed for curlew.
Go back to the woodland then, just again, maybe you've said it already, but the minimum distance from scrub or woodland, and is it different for a single tree? The way we're removing single trees at times from areas. So how far from a woodland and how far from a single tree?
Well, I suppose from afforestation, research has shown that there is an increase in predation for up to 1 kilometre from the edge of that forest. But we do know that waders don't like trees and they don't like scrub, and general rule of thumb is about 100 metres from a tree or scrub, they won't use or won't nest. It makes them more vulnerable to predation. So if their main nesting area or main chick rearing area is within 100 metres of a tree or scrub, that's not a good.
I suppose the difference there, Kathryn, would it be that in the woodland you'll have the foxes and things coming out of it. The single tree is the perching post for the okay. So there's a slight difference there.
The question there, looking at your map and observing that there seems to be a better holding of population in Northern Ireland than there has been in the Republic, and is there any difference in policy or practice that has led to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose Northern Ireland and the UK have had measures in their agri-environmental programme for breeding waders for much longer than we have. I mean, they're probably they've been ahead of the game for a long time, whereas we've only really, Gloss was the first breeding wader measure we had in the national programme.
And a final one for me there about, will we need to, either conservation keepers or trained farmers in a scheme like what you've done, will we need to do it forever?
I mean, certainly in the medium term at this point, I mean, these species are incredibly vulnerable and critical at this point. And I suppose it's very hard to say because it really depends on how our agri systems evolve down the line as to whether we can reinstate a balance. But certainly if a population is robust and strong, it should be able to sustain a certain level of predation. That's a natural. That's natural.
I suppose we're running out of time. I think one of the messages is that we need to continue studying and continue learning. And you said there's hopefully another EIP coming up, but I presume that the target now has got to be to get the areas that we can work in identified and pulled into our agri-environmental scheme processes that have developed so well over the last number of years, but need to be extended to support the breeding waders. Is that a fair sum up of where we need to move?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're at the point now, I mean, it's in the CP zone. We know it's going to be form part of, our measures are going to form part of the National Breeding Wader Programme. And I suppose we really now need to look at supporting our advisors with advice and training on how to implement this measure and how to deliver this information to the farmers on the ground, because that is going to be the key measure of success going forward.
Okay, listen, thank you very much. I think we've all learned a huge amount, and it's really good to I think just make people aware of the learnings that have been coming from the EIP. Continued success with the work you're doing, and with a bit of luck, I think we'll see mainstreaming and hopefully improvements in numbers to back that up. But that's, I suppose, is the ultimate challenge, and that's where we need to get to. So listen, thank you very much, Kathryn. Really fascinating presentation. Thank you for staying with us through some of the challenges we had through the presentation. It happens. So thanks for that. Thank you to Kathryn for your help with questions. Thanks for Mary for in the background. Next week in the theme that we're talking about, it's maybe a little bit of a case of poacher turned gamekeeper, or gamekeeper turned poacher, because I'm part of the presentation team next week, presenting with Mark Plunkett, and looking at past, current, and possible future fertilizer use and soil fertility based on information that we gather within Teagasc. So until next week, enjoy your weekend, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.